In the programmatic statements at the beginning of Plato's Timaeus, there is an implied configuration of connections that has become canonical in the Platonic tradition. For a start, the Timaeus is set upon the festival of the Panathenaea. Visitors from Magna Graecia are in Athens for the festival of the goddess. This is the same narrative device around which the dialogue called Parmenides is framed, and so we are surely supposed to see a connection between the two works. Thus, in the Platonic tradition, these two works were seen as complementary, one concerning cosmology and the other metaphysics. But as Socrates speaks, we are also told that the day before he had given an account of the ideal city, and he gives a summary of the first part of the dialogue called the Republic. Now he wants to see the ideal state in action, and so we are surely to see a connection with that work as well. The Republic, of course, is regarded as Plato's masterpiece and is central among Plato's writings. In this configuration, it is linked with the Timaeus and the Parmenides, such that the Platonic tradition has often seen these three works as a set and as the core of the Platonic corpus. Accordingly, we can distinguish three great streams of Platonism, and Platonists, a very broad category, are usually of one of these three complexions. There are those whose primary focus is metaphysics, the Parmenides, those whose focus is the political, sociological, psychological and ethical Plato of the Republic, and then there are those whose Platonism is essentially cosmological, the Timaeus. Needless to say, these areas overlap and we are schematizing, but there are nonetheless three main directions in which Platonic thought is developed. It's a useful model. Of the three, the path of the Republic is by far the most common. That is, most Platonism is a development of the doctrines and teachings of the Republic, which is also to say it is Socratic. We can distinguish between three wider traditions that extend out from Plato's key works: the Socratic, the Eleatic, and the Pythagorean. Socrates is the hero of the Republic, but the Parmenides is, in a sense, anti-Socratic, since Father Parmenides puts young Socrates in his place. And the Timaeus is, in a sense, non-Socratic. It is a long, uninterrupted monologue by Timaeus of Locri in which Socrates plays no part. Socrates is the key figure in Platonic ethics, but the Platonic metaphysical tradition leads to Parmenides and the Eleatics, while the cosmological tradition leads to the Pythagoreans. And yes, we might say that Socrates, at least Plato's Socrates, was a Parmenidean and a Pythagorean, but the distinctions are still meaningful. Platonists tend to diverge along these lines and then pursue the Platonic tradition in one of these directions. This is testimony to the sheer fecundity of Plato. Not only was his forehead broad, Platon, but his philosophy is of such extraordinary breadth that it is the starting point of great highways of thought. Or to use a different metaphor, Plato is the great progenitor of many remarkably rich intellectual pedigrees. For example, Socratic ethics lies at the root of the later and largely Roman Stoic tradition. The reputed founder of Stoicism, Zeno, is said to have been inspired by Socrates, and Stoicism is built upon and develops several central themes of Socratic asceticism. But more generally, Stoicism is the fruit of the Socratic revolution documented in the Platonic dialogues that shifted the emphasis of ancient philosophy to ethical questions, the Socratic question, how should one live, as opposed to the cosmological preoccupations of the pre-Socratics. Those who pursue the Socratic ethical tradition are very likely to embrace Stoicism as its natural practical extension. Alternatively, they are drawn to Christian ethics, which are themselves deeply influenced by the Stoicism of Epictetus, underpinned by parallels between Socrates of Athens and Jesus of Nazareth as moral heroes. In any case, this is a road to Rome, whether the secular ethics of the Latin Stoics or the ethical soteriology of Christianity. Many roads from Plato, however, are diverted through Aristotle. Indeed, the discovery of the works of Aristotle by the Romans so changed the philosophical landscape that much of the Platonic heritage was subsumed by Aristotelianism and the Peripatetics. And from that time on, it became standard to read Plato through Aristotle and to blend the two together in various forms. This, Plato subsumed by Aristotle, became the major philosophical tradition of Western civilization. It was taken up by the Roman Church. Eastern Orthodoxy remained more properly Platonic, which is to say non-Aristotelian, but in the West, Aristotelian Platonism prevailed. This is one of the most illustrious intellectual pedigrees in Western history. The intrusion of Aristotle also gives rise to that school of ancient thought that 19th century scholars dubbed Neoplatonism. This is not merely a case of Plato revisited, as the prefix neo suggests. Rather, this is a Platonism, via so-called Middle Platonism, that has absorbed, along with much else, peripatetic thought. This was a particularly rich synthesis and was subsequently influential in the Christian and Islamic traditions as ancient philosophy gave way to the monotheisms. In general, the mystical Platonism of both the Christians and the Muslims was a development of Aristotle-infused Neoplatonic thought rather than directly from Plato himself. The place of Aristotle in a man's Platonism is telling. For much of the Middle Ages, Christians and Muslims were happy to conflate and confuse Plato and Aristotle, or else sought to reconcile them. Famously, in Raphael's School of Athens, they are complementary. But there is always that mode of Platonism that resists Aristotelian revision. Aristotle is a major intersection, but not all roads from Plato go through it. A great many Platonists, especially those of the metaphysical bent, and we might say non-Aristotelian ones, have been inclined to align Plato not with the monotheisms, but with the non-dualist Vedanta of India. In the modern era especially, an acute problem for Platonists of any stripe is to situate themselves within a living, functioning philosophy and philosophical and spiritual tradition. Classical academic Platonism is an arid museum. Ancient philosophy was a living praxis. Where can a living Platonism as a living discipline be found? There are some profound parallels between Platonic thought and Advaita Vedanta, the works of Shankara in particular. So many Platonists take the road to India. This has been a notable trend among my own contemporaries. The trend was viable because India had been in the embrace of the British Empire. Vedanta, non-dualism, and Platonic metaphysics are certainly compatible. Similarly, some readers of the Republic, more political and sociological than metaphysical, find parallels between the vocational order described in Plato's Ideal Polity and the traditional Hindu social system, and attempt a Platonic Hindu synthesis as well. Political traditionalism often takes this form. Not all roads lead to India, however. The Platonic cosmology leads naturally in a quite different direction and finds few resonances in Indian thought. The cosmological system has roots that are signalled in the Timaeus itself. The dialogue is prefaced by an account of Solon's supposed journey to Egypt, where he is schooled by the Egyptian high priests who chide the Greeks for being mere children. There is an Egyptian Plato. Indeed, strong ancient traditions report that Plato spent time there during his years of exile following Socrates' execution. Elements of the Egyptian Plato are part of the Neoplatonic synthesis, but the full debt of Plato to the Egyptian tradition has only been explored in recent times, such as in the pioneering studies of the Lithuanian scholar Elgus Uzdavinas. This brings us to an altogether different intellectual landscape. The Timaeus, rather than the Republic or the Parmenides, becomes the pivotal text. There is a cosmological path, as distinct from the metaphysical or ethical. This invites a different Platonic journey, leading to neither India nor Rome. There is a different road, following a different pedigree across many cultures, with the Timaeus the central juncture and its connections to Egypt primary. The most important link is between the Platonic cosmology and alchemy. The Platonic demiurge, the central figure in Plato's cosmology, is a philosophical configuration of the blacksmith god Hephaestus, or the Egyptian god Ptah. The smith is the prototype of the alchemist. The cosmology in which the cosmos is crafted by a smith deity is inherently alchemical. The alchemical tradition is opaque, to say the least, but it presents itself as the art of the philosophers. It seems an unlikely claim, but the blacksmith, the most brutish of manual workers, is the keeper of the inner secrets of metals and the substance of the universe. The golden thread of Platonism can be pursued into the alchemical traditions, which are themselves broad and rich. It is worth noting, though, that alchemy is not developed so much in the Indian tradition. The Islamic and the Chinese traditions are conspicuously alchemical. It is notable that the Hindu tradition does not have a central alchemical cosmology. That is a major point of divergence. From Athens, we travel to Egypt and the cognate schools of thought we find there, such as Hermeticism. The cosmological Plato takes us to those Egyptian developments, or the Greco-Egyptian developments of the late dynasties. Egypt then becomes the point of departure, not Rome. Detractors will say that this gives rise to an obscurantist Platonism, the Plato of magic and theurgy. But this is only one dimension of an extremely rich and deep tradition. At the same time, for example, Egypt links this Platonism to the Judeo-Christian and Islamic nexus of stories, the Oriental Abrahamic world. So, for example, Philo-Judaeus becomes an important thinker in this context. Egypt provides a bridge into a wider world of ideas. We can appreciate that Plato is a representative of a much wider, deeper and more ancient stream of thought. The Platonic cosmology is not something that Plato has invented, but is rather a record of a tradition of cosmological philosophy with motifs and themes shared by an array of philosophies, religions and mythologies. The Timaeus is an unusually pregnant text when extended beyond its immediate Greek context. It can be, therefore, the starting point, the platform for wide-ranging explorations across cultures. Rather than westwards to Rome, we can go eastwards to Egypt. One can go back in time into the pre-Socratics, then the Homeric world, or one can move out via Egypt into a wider sphere. All along, we can pursue a single coherent line of Platonic thinking. There is a single configuration of philosophical ideas and mythological motifs nascent in Plato's cosmology that can be found across diverse cultures. It is largely non-Aristotelian. Indeed, we can see it clearer if we remove Aristotle from our reckonings altogether. Plato, in the Timaeus and other works, participates in a very deep, ancient and widespread doctrine, or complex of doctrines, that has its ultimate roots in early metallurgical traditions and alchemy primordiale. We find its reiterations across many ancient civilizations, notably Egypt, albeit often as a secret or hidden body of knowledge. That is the way of the cosmological Plato. For all his natural science, there is not the slightest sign of that Aristotle has any acquaintance with this strand of Plato at all. In this sense, Aristotle is profane. Again, the cosmological Plato cannot be neatly separated from Platonic metaphysics or psychology or ethics, but there are certain themes in Plato for which the Timaeus is the central text. When we speak of the Platonic cosmological tradition, we do not necessarily mean a continuous textual tradition from Plato himself. No one proposes a textual link between Plato and Shankara. Rather, it's a case of compatible and similar constructions sharing a broad highway of ideas. Henry Corbin once said that being a philosopher means taking to the road. You pursue it wherever it takes you. Once you start out on one of these highways, you have no choice in the matter. Plato is not an isolated thinker, but a spokesman, a representative of a greater stream of cosmological teachings that can be pursued in various iterations in both obvious and unlikely places. We discover in the end, regardless of what aspect of Plato we pursue, that he is representative of a much older tradition, much more widespread and more ancient. The Platonic is really a mode that we find across cultures and periods, and of which Plato himself, the Greek philosopher, is an epitome.